It was a quiet afternoon in the suburbs of Savannah, Georgia. The Adams house was a grand colonial mansion, a legacy passed down through generations. But behind its ornate windows and pristine garden lay a dark secret that poisoned the atmosphere. Elizabeth, a 10-year-old girl, was the adopted daughter of Charles Adams, a widowed businessman known for his methodical and reserved demeanor. Elizabeth was a peculiar child with large, curious eyes that seemed to see beyond what was in front of her. She had been adopted by Charles 3 years prior after a long search for a family. Despite gaining a home, something unsettling lingered in the way her father treated her, distant in public, yet controlling and authoritarian at home. The housekeeper, Martha, a woman in her 50s, had worked for the Adams family since the days of Charles's late wife. She cared for Elizabeth most of the time, and with her nurturing demeanor, noticed troubling signs in the girl's behavior. Elizabeth seemed constantly anxious, and the drawings she hid under her bed were dark, filled with distorted figures and claustrophobic settings. One evening, while finishing up in the kitchen, Martha heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. Peeking through the slightly open door, she saw Charles leading Elizabeth, a firm hand on her shoulder, toward the 3rd floor, where he kept what he called the office. It was a room no one but him was allowed to enter. The screams began minutes later. Martha froze, clutching the dishcloth tightly. At first she thought they were imagined, noises amplified by her anxious mind, but soon realized the screams were unmistakably coming from the 3rd floor. Elizabeth was sobbing and begging, her words interspersed with the low, threatening tone of Charles. Without thinking, Martha ran through the hallways and up the stairs. The door to the office was ajar. Inside, the scene made her heart nearly stop. Charles was kneeling near Elizabeth, who was trembling in a corner. A heavy leather belt lay on the floor beside him, and there were red marks on the girl's arms. "What's going on here?" Martha demanded, her voice echoing through the room. Charles turned abruptly, his eyes filled with fury. "This is none of your business, Martha. Get back to your duties." "This isn't discipline, Mr. Adams. This is abuse," Martha replied, with more courage than she thought she had. Charles stepped toward her menacingly, but before he could say anything, Elizabeth screamed, "He locked me in there. I don't want to go back." Martha's heart broke at the girl's confession. Realizing he was losing control of the situation, Charles shoved Martha out of the room and locked the door. Martha spent the rest of the night restless, listening to muffled murmurs from behind the locked door. In the days that followed, Martha remained vigilant. Whenever Charles went upstairs with Elizabeth, she tried to listen from the outside, but he was more cautious. Meanwhile, Elizabeth grew increasingly withdrawn. Then Martha found something shocking. While changing Elizabeth's bed linens, she discovered a note hidden beneath the pillow. "Martha, please help me. I can't take it anymore." The plea for help confirmed Martha's worst fears. She began piecing together the puzzle surrounding Charles and his adopted daughter. Each day, her resolve to protect Elizabeth grew, but so did her fear of confronting her employer. Charles was known as a meticulous and ruthless businessman. Outside of work, his stern demeanor intimidated anyone who tried to delve too deeply into his personal life. When Martha had been hired years earlier, the house had been different. Charles' wife, Margaret, had been kind and sweet, the soul of the mansion. After her sudden death in a car accident, Charles became even more withdrawn. Many suspected he had never recovered from the tragedy, but recent events revealed something far darker, a man seemingly incapable of affection. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was a child who had not yet lost hope despite her struggles. On rare occasions when she could play in the garden or help Martha with chores, her intelligence and vivid imagination shone through. "You like to draw, don't you?" Martha asked once, trying to gain her trust. Elizabeth looked down nervously. "My father doesn't like it. He says I'm wasting time." Martha realized that Charles exerted more control than she had imagined. It wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The girl seemed burdened by constant fear, as if every word or action could provoke her father's wrath. The house and the secret room. The Adams mansion was imposing, with long, silent hallways that seemed to harbor secrets. The third floor was the most mysterious part. Charles's office was actually a windowless room with dark wooden paneling and thick walls that muffled any sound. Martha had never fully entered it but observed details while cleaning. There was a heavy desk covered in papers and a leather armchair. At the back, a smaller, almost hidden door stood, what Elizabeth referred to as the door of fear. It was there that Charles often took her. One day, while cleaning the office, during a rare moment when Charles was away, Martha noticed a key discreetly hanging behind a painting. The key was small, but seemed important. An uneasy feeling crept over her, as though the object held the answer to Elizabeth's cries. Martha decided to investigate, but knew she had to wait for the right moment. Elizabeth's past. The adoption papers for Elizabeth were locked away in Charles's office, leaving Martha with little knowledge about how the girl came to live there. Gradually, however, Elizabeth shared fragments of her life before the adoption. "I had a small house with my mum. She used to sing to me before I fell asleep," said Elizabeth softly one day. "What happened to her?" Martha asked, trying not to push the little girl. "She got sick and went to the hospital. She never came back." After her mother's death, Elizabeth was sent to an orphanage. Charles seemed to have adopted her not out of compassion, but for reasons that remained unclear. Perhaps loneliness drove him, or maybe there was something darker behind his decision. Martha decides to act one night. After Charles left for an appointment, Martha approached Elizabeth. "I need to know what's happening upstairs, sweetheart. Do you trust me?" she asked, holding the girl's small hands. Elizabeth hesitated, but eventually nodded. "He takes me to the little room," she said, pointing to the hidden door in the office. "He makes me stay there in the dark. He says, I need to learn how to obey." Martha's heart nearly broke upon hearing this. She couldn't delay her decision any longer. That same night, after putting Elizabeth to bed, Martha went up to the office. The key was still there, hanging behind the painting. With trembling hands, she unlocked the small door. What she saw inside made her stomach churn. The space was tiny, with raw concrete walls. In the center stood an old chair with leather straps attached to its arms, like an improvised restraint device. Scratch marks covered the walls, and pieces of chalk lay scattered on the floor, as if Elizabeth had tried to leave messages no one would ever read. Martha quickly shut the door, her heart racing. Now she had proof. Charles wasn't just abusing Elizabeth, he was breaking her spirit. Martha knew she had to act fast. Elizabeth's living conditions weren't just cruel, they were leaving deep scars on her mind and soul. But confronting Charles directly would be dangerous. He was wealthy, powerful, and influential in the community. Martha needed a way to expose his crimes and protect Elizabeth before it was too late. An unexpected ally. The next day, Martha decided to seek help. She reached out to an old friend, Grace, who worked as a social worker in the county. Grace was known for her determination and courage in handling cases of abuse and neglect. "Martha, if everything you're saying is true, we need to act." "But do you have proof?" Grace asked after hearing the story. "I have a note Elizabeth wrote, and I've seen the small room in his office. I can try to take pictures, but I need you to make sure this is taken seriously," Martha pleaded. Grace agreed to help, but warned that the process would be challenging. Charles had a stellar reputation in the community, and without concrete evidence, it would be hard to convince anyone he was a danger to Elizabeth. "Be careful, Martha. Men like him can be dangerous when cornered." A risky plan. Martha acted as if nothing had happened. She continued her daily chores, cared for Elizabeth, and pretended to follow Charles's orders while discreetly gathering evidence. One evening, when Charles went to the city's business club, Martha entered the office again, this time with a camera borrowed from Grace. She took photos of the secret room, the leather strap Charles used for punishment, and even a small journal she found in the desk drawer. The journal contained disturbing notes. "Elizabeth needs to learn how to be strong. It's my responsibility to shape her, even if it means pain." Martha felt a chill run down her spine as she read those words, but knew this was the proof needed to protect the girl. The confrontation. 2 days later, Charles noticed something was off. Martha saw his behavior change. He seemed more alert, as if suspecting something. That night, after putting Elizabeth to bed, Martha was confronted by Charles in the hallway. He was holding something in his hands, the journal she had photographed. "You think you can deceive me?" he asked with a chilling calmness. "I know you've been snooping through my things." Martha tried to hide her fear. "Mr. Adams, I was just cleaning the office, like I always do." "Don't lie to me, Martha. You've gone too far." Before she could reply, he stepped closer, his presence menacing. "Elizabeth is my daughter, and you have no right to meddle in what happens in this house." Martha, her heart racing, summoned all the courage she had. "She doesn't deserve what you're doing to her. You may think you own her, but she's just a child, and I won't stand by and let this continue." Charles smiled coldly. "Then you're fired. Pack your things and leave in the morning." Martha's decision. Charles's threat didn't scare Martha. In fact, it only strengthened her resolve. Before leaving, she managed to speak to Elizabeth privately. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'm going to fix this," she whispered. The next morning, Martha left the house, but her plan was already in motion. She handed the photos and Elizabeth's note to Grace, who quickly involved the authorities. Still, bringing Charles to justice wouldn't be simple. He had influential lawyers and would use every resource to escape the charges. Knowing he would try to manipulate the situation, Martha went a step further. She contacted a local journalist known for exposing powerful figures. "This will be risky, but the public needs to know the truth," she told the journalist, handing over copies of the evidence. Charles's downfall. Within days, the story made headlines across local news outlets. The headline read, "Prominent man accused of abusing adopted daughter." The community was in shock. While some defended Charles, many began to question his integrity. The evidence was irrefutable, and public pressure forced the authorities to open a formal investigation. Charles, enraged, tried to intimidate Martha. He showed up at her new job, threatening to sue her for defamation. But Martha stood her ground. "Do whatever you want, Charles. I won't stop until Elizabeth is safe," she said firmly. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was removed from the house and temporarily placed under Grace's care. For the first time, the girl seemed relieved, free from Charles's suffocating control. With Elizabeth in a safe place, the case against Charles Adams began to gain traction. Martha, alongside Grace, followed the legal and emotional developments closely while trying to comfort Elizabeth, who was finally beginning to feel protected. However, the battle was far from over. Charles's defense. Charles hired one of the best attorneys in the region, known for using aggressive strategies to discredit victims and overturn seemingly impossible cases. The lawyer argued that the accusations were exaggerated, the product of a vindictive housekeeper and a social worker seeking attention. Meanwhile, Elizabeth faced her own struggles. Even away from the house, she continued to have constant nightmares. She dreamed of the small, dark room and woke up screaming, refusing to go back to sleep. Martha did her best to comfort her, but knew Elizabeth needed professional help. Martha's connection to the past. During this time, Martha dealt with her own personal battle. Witnessing Elizabeth's suffering brought back memories of her own childhood. Martha had grown up in an abusive household where her mother was controlled by a violent father. Seeing Elizabeth go through something similar rekindled her pain, but also strengthened her resolve to break the cycle. One day, as she saw Elizabeth drawing on Grace's porch, Martha felt a pang in her heart. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" she asked. Elizabeth held up the paper. It was a drawing of the dark little room, detailed beyond what one would expect from a child. Beside it was a small figure, Elizabeth, and a woman holding her hand, clearly representing Martha. "You saved me," Elizabeth said in a quiet but firm voice. Martha realized her fight wasn't just about exposing Charles. It was about helping Elizabeth rebuild her life and giving her the chance to dream again. Charles's counterattacks. Meanwhile, Charles's attorney ramped up the attacks. During a preliminary hearing, he presented testimonies from former employees who praised Charles as a fair and reserved employer. He also argued that Martha had personal motivations for attacking him, citing a minor disagreement they had years earlier. But Elizabeth's testimony became the most powerful element of the case. Sitting in the courtroom with trembling hands, the girl recounted in detail how her adoptive father had locked her in the dark room and threatened her if she ever told anyone. "He said that if I told, no one would believe me," she said. The courtroom fell silent. Elizabeth's words, though spoken with difficulty, were clear and undeniable. Even so, Charles insisted on his innocence, claiming Elizabeth had behavioral issues and that he was merely trying to discipline her. His narrative began to crumble when adoption records revealed inconsistencies. It became clear that Charles hadn't chosen to adopt Elizabeth out of compassion. Instead, it was discovered that Elizabeth's biological mother had a prior relationship with Charles before her death, a detail he had tried to conceal. The truth unveiled. The revelation of the connection between Charles and Elizabeth's mother shifted the case's trajectory. Charles had adopted Elizabeth not out of altruism, but to maintain a sinister control over something he considered his. This information made the jury begin to question his intentions. However, what truly shook Charles was an unexpected move by Martha. Remembering a conversation she had with Grace, she approached the press again. This time, in a live interview, Martha shared her full story, connecting her own experience to Elizabeth's case. "I grew up in a home where fear was constant, where no one believed I needed help. I won't let Elizabeth go through the same thing," she said. The interview struck a chord with the public, and social pressure intensified. Protests began outside Charles's home, with neighbors demanding justice. Grace's role. While fighting the case, Grace faced her own challenges. Working within a system that often failed children was disheartening. However, Elizabeth's case inspired her to push for significant changes. Grace began advocating for public campaigns to protect children in similar situations, using Elizabeth's story as an example of what needed to change. She also spent more time with Elizabeth, helping her open up and find ways to express her feelings. "You're very brave, Elizabeth," Grace told her one day while looking at a colorful drawing the girl had made. Elizabeth smiled for the first time in weeks. A persistent threat. Despite the progress, Charles did not give up easily. Before the final trial, Martha found an anonymous note on her doorstep. "Think carefully before you continue. I know where you live." Martha reported the note to the police, but knew she needed to be more cautious. Charles's shadow loomed over her, but the image of Elizabeth smiling gave her strength. The trial was nearing its climax, and Charles Adams seemed increasingly cornered. The media scrutiny, Elizabeth's powerful testimony, and the evidence Martha had collected created a nearly insurmountable case against him. However, Charles wasn't the type of man to accept defeat easily. 2 days before the final hearing, Martha received an unexpected phone call. A muffled male voice said, "If you don't drop the charges, something will happen to Elizabeth." Martha froze. She knew Charles was powerful and wouldn't hesitate to resort to desperate measures. But threatening Elizabeth was the last straw. Instead of scaring her off, the threat only strengthened her resolve to defeat him. A crucial discovery. The next morning, Martha met with Grace to share the threat and discuss their next steps. Always analytical, Grace suggested they review the documents and evidence they had collected once more. "Charles is desperate. That means he's hiding something," Grace said. The two spent hours poring over old papers until Martha found a yellowed envelope tucked between the pages of Charles's diary. Inside was a copy of Elizabeth's biological mother's will. The document revealed that Elizabeth's mother had left her a small inheritance, including a house and some savings. Strangely, the will had never been executed. Instead, Charles had gained custody of Elizabeth and taken control of her assets. "He didn't adopt Elizabeth out of love or compassion," Martha whispered, horrified. "He wanted her money. This revelation completely shifted the direction of the case. With Grace's help, Martha contacted the prosecution's lawyer, who immediately added the new evidence to the case. Charles wasn't just an abuser, he had manipulated the system to steal from a vulnerable child. The night of retaliation. The night before the final hearing, something unexpected happened. Martha was at home, preparing for the next day, when she heard the sound of breaking glass. Rushing downstairs, she found her living room engulfed in flames. Someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail through the window. Martha managed to escape, but almost all of her belongings were destroyed in the fire. When the firefighters arrived, one of them found a charred note near the front door. "You were warned." Despite the attack, Martha refused to back down. "They can burn my house, but they won't break my spirit," she told Grace, standing amidst the wreckage. The attempt to intimidate her failed miserably. Instead, it rallied the community's support for Martha and Elizabeth. The day of judgment. The courtroom was thick with tension. Charles sat stone-faced, maintaining his cold, controlled demeanor as Martha's lawyer presented the new evidence. The biological mother's will was a devastating blow to Charles's defense. It became clear that he had exploited his influence to manipulate the adoption process and seize Elizabeth's inheritance. The turning point came during Elizabeth's testimony. She entered the courtroom hesitantly, but found the strength she needed when she looked at Martha. "He used to tell me I was nothing, that nobody cared about me," Elizabeth began, her voice trembling but firm. "But Martha cared. She showed me I deserve to be loved." Her words brought tears to the audience, including the jury. Even Charles' lawyer appeared shaken by the courage of the child his client had tried to break. Charles' downfall. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Charles was convicted of child abuse, fraud, and embezzlement. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison with no chance of parole for the first 10 years. The public celebrated the outcome, but for Martha, the true victory was seeing Elizabeth smile as they left the courthouse. "It's over, sweetheart. He can't hurt you anymore," Martha said, holding the girl in a tight embrace. An unexpected revelation. After the trial, Martha received surprising news. The lawyer handling Elizabeth's mother's will informed her that Elizabeth was entitled to a sum large enough to secure her education and future. "She'll be in good hands with you, Martha," Grace said, smiling. At that moment, Martha realized her fight wasn't over. She decided to formally apply for Elizabeth's custody, offering her a home filled with love and safety. Healing the past. Although Charles was behind bars, Elizabeth's journey of healing was just beginning. With support from Martha, Grace, and a specialized therapist, she started rebuilding her trust in others. "You're a warrior, Elizabeth," Martha told her every night before bed. Once haunted by fear, Elizabeth began to see the world as a place of possibilities, community support, and new beginnings. Charles Adams' conviction marked a significant milestone, but it left lasting scars. The house where so many traumatic moments had occurred was sold to pay off debts Charles had accumulated during the trial. For Elizabeth, this symbolized closure, a goodbye to the place where fear had ruled her life. Elizabeth was placed under Martha's temporary custody while the adoption process was reviewed. This new chapter brought challenges for both of them. Elizabeth struggled to fully trust others, while Martha worked to find a balance between protecting the girl and allowing her the freedom to thrive. The story gained national attention, covered by TV shows and newspapers. Once indifferent neighbors rallied around Martha and Elizabeth. The local community organized fundraisers to help Martha rebuild her home after the fire. However, the attention wasn't all positive. Some questioned why Martha had taken so long to act. In a televised interview, Martha explained, "Sometimes fear paralyzes us, but love moves us. Elizabeth gave me courage I didn't know I had." These words were widely shared, touching the hearts of thousands. Elizabeth's challenge. For Elizabeth, the biggest obstacle was facing the internal ghosts Charles had left behind. Even though she was safe with Martha, the memories of the small, dark room still haunted her. Certain sounds and places triggered anxiety attacks, and she often withdrew into herself. "Will I ever be normal, Martha?" Elizabeth asked one night as they sat together on the porch of their new house. Martha held her hand firmly. "You are normal, my dear, and you're stronger than you think." With the help of a child therapist, Elizabeth began finding ways to express her feelings. Her drawings, once dark and anguished, gradually began to feature brighter colors and hopeful landscapes. Martha's redemption. Martha also went through her own transformation. The fight to save Elizabeth forced her to confront her own past traumas. Inspired by the girl's bravery, she started attending support groups for abuse survivors, sharing her story for the first time. "I never imagined I'd have the chance to change anything," Martha confessed in one of the meetings. "But saving Elizabeth saved me too." Martha also began working with Grace on child abuse awareness campaigns, visiting schools and churches to educate communities about recognizing and reporting abuse. The past that lingers. Despite the courtroom victory, Charles was not completely forgotten. Occasionally, Elizabeth would ask about him. "Will he ever get out of prison?" she asked once, her expression tinged with fear. Martha responded honestly without alarming her. "Maybe, but we'll be ready, and you'll never be alone." That reassurance seemed to comfort Elizabeth, though the specter of Charles continued to linger in her memories. A new beginning. 6 months after the trial, the adoption request was approved. Martha officially became Elizabeth's mother. The court ceremony was intimate but filled with emotion. Grace was there, along with some of the people who had helped along the way. "I'm not just your mom, Elizabeth. I'm your biggest fan," Martha said, embracing the girl after signing the documents. Elizabeth started attending a new school, where she found support and made friends. Although she was still cautious, there were clear signs of recovery. During a class project, she wrote a short poem that Martha later found. "I was a seed in the dark, but someone watered me. Now I'm growing, and one day I'll be a strong tree." These words confirmed that despite all the challenges, Elizabeth was finding her way to happiness. National impact. Martha and Elizabeth's story continued to inspire people across the country. Documentaries and books were made, exploring the courage it took to stand up to a powerful man and the resilience of a girl who survived abuse. Martha donated part of the proceeds to organizations fighting child abuse, always reminding herself that her mission was bigger than just seeking justice for Elizabeth. Their new routine brought challenges but also moments of joy and discovery. Free from Charles's oppressive control, Elizabeth began exploring aspects of her personality she had never been able to show before. She joined extracurricular activities at school and found solace in art, developing a remarkable talent for painting. Martha, in turn, focused on creating a home where Elizabeth could feel safe and loved. Though recovery was slow, every small step forward felt like a victory. A new home. Thanks to donations from the community and Elizabeth's inheritance, Martha was able to buy a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood. Unlike the cold Adams mansion, the new home was warm and inviting, with vibrant colors and a sense of love in every corner. In Elizabeth's room, Martha helped her set up a small art studio. There, Elizabeth spent hours painting, expressing emotions she couldn't always put into words. "You know you have a lot of talent, don't you?" Martha asked once, admiring a painting of a bright blue sky over a field of flowers. Elizabeth shrugged but smiled. "I just paint what I feel." The journey to healing. Despite the progress, the past still resurfaced unexpectedly. Certain sounds or situations would bring back memories of the secret room, and Elizabeth struggled to control her reactions. "Why won't it just go away, Martha?" she asked during one of these episodes. Martha held her in a tight hug. "It's not something that disappears all at once, sweetheart, but you're getting stronger every day. Those memories don't define who you are." With her therapist's guidance, Elizabeth began to understand that healing was a long journey, but one she could navigate. Therapy also strengthened the bond between her and Martha. During one session, Elizabeth wrote a symbolic letter to Charles, something the therapist suggested as part of her emotional release process. "You tried to break me, but you couldn't. I'm not the girl you tried to destroy. Now I'm free." Although the letter was never sent, it represented a milestone in Elizabeth's recovery, a legacy of love and courage. Inspired by Elizabeth's strength, Martha decided to expand her involvement in campaigns against child abuse. At a community meeting, she shared her experience and presented a plan to create a foundation in Elizabeth's name, focused on providing legal and emotional support to children in need. "No child should face what Elizabeth faced," Martha said to the audience, "and no one should feel that they are alone in this fight." The foundation, called Roots of Hope, quickly gained recognition. With help from Grace and other volunteers, the project offered support to families and also provided training to identify signs of abuse. Elizabeth finding her voice. Over time, Elizabeth also began to get involved in the foundation. Initially shy, she preferred to work behind the scenes, helping Martha organize events and creating visual materials for the campaign. But on a special occasion, she was invited to speak at a school about her experience. "I was afraid to tell my story," Elizabeth began, facing an audience of children and teachers. "But I learned that fear loses its power when we find someone who believes in us." Her speech was brief but powerful. After that, Elizabeth began to participate more actively in initiatives, realizing that sharing her experience helped other children find the courage to seek help. The awakening of a dream. One afternoon, Elizabeth showed Martha a portfolio of her paintings. "Well, what do you think about me trying for an exhibition?" she asked, with a hesitation that Martha recognized as fear of rejection. "I think it's a wonderful idea," Martha replied with enthusiasm. With help from Grace and other friends, Elizabeth managed to organize her first exhibition at a local gallery. The show, titled Shadows and Light, featured works that told the story of her journey from the days of darkness to her new life filled with hope. The exhibition was a success. People were moved by the depth and sincerity of her paintings, and Elizabeth began to receive invitations to exhibit her work in other places. A moment of reconciliation with the past. Although life was moving forward, Elizabeth knew she could never completely erase the past. One time, while walking through a park, she saw a family playing, with the father chasing after his children. "Do you think he ever thought he was doing something good?" she asked Martha, referring to Charles. Martha took a moment to respond. "Maybe he thought he was in control, but it was never about you. It was about his own demons, and you don't need to carry that." Elizabeth seemed to consider this, then took a deep breath and smiled. "I think I'm finally starting to believe that." A promising future. In the years that followed, Elizabeth continued to grow as an artist and as a person. The Roots of Hope Foundation expanded its operations, helping thousands of children in vulnerable situations. Martha became a symbol of courage and resilience, and Elizabeth, a living example that love and courage can transform even the deepest wounds. "Are you proud of me, Martha?" Elizabeth asked one night as they watched the starry sky. "More than you can imagine, dear." And for the first time, Elizabeth felt that she could leave the past behind and embrace the future with confidence. Although Elizabeth and Martha were rebuilding their lives, the ghost of Charles Adams silently loomed over them both. He was still in prison, but rumors about possible appeals started to circulate. Some lawyers claimed that Charles could have his sentence reduced for good behavior, which filled Martha with concern. To protect Elizabeth and solidify their future, Martha decided to strengthen the legal and emotional measures that would ensure the girls' safety. At the same time, she knew they needed to face this last obstacle head-on, without letting fear once again take control of their lives. A past that returns to haunt one afternoon. While Martha was organizing documents for the foundation, she received a call from Grace. "Martha, have you seen the news?" Grace asked, her voice filled with urgency. Martha stopped what she was doing and turned on the TV. There was the headline she feared most: "Businessman convicted of child abuse seeks to reduce sentence in court appeal." The report explained that Charles had hired a new team of lawyers to appeal the sentence, claiming that his health had deteriorated in prison. They argued that he should serve the rest of his sentence under house arrest, which could bring him closer to Elizabeth. Martha felt a knot in her stomach. Despite all the progress Elizabeth had made, the thought of Charles coming near again could destroy the fragile balance they had achieved. Elizabeth discovers the truth. Martha tried to keep the news from Elizabeth, but couldn't for long. The girl overheard a conversation between Martha and Grace, and seeing the worried look on her mother's face, she knew something was wrong. "Is he going to get out?" Elizabeth asked, looking at Martha with eyes full of fear. Martha hesitated but decided that Elizabeth deserved the truth. "He's trying, dear, but we will do everything we can to stop him." Elizabeth took a deep breath. Despite her fear, there was something different in her, a determination Martha had never seen before. "I'm not going to let him control me again." Preparing the defense, Martha and Grace began working intensively to ensure that Charles's appeal would be denied. They gathered new testimonies from Elizabeth and reviewed all legal documents to find any loopholes that could strengthen the case against him. "He may have an expensive legal team, but we have the truth on our side," Grace said, trying to reassure Martha. Elizabeth also wanted to participate. During a meeting with the prosecutor, the girl surprised everyone when she said, "I want to write a letter to the judge. I want to tell him how my life was before and how I'm finally free now." The lawyer was impressed by Elizabeth's maturity and agreed to include the letter in the case. Elizabeth's letter. With help from Martha and Grace, Elizabeth wrote a powerful and emotional letter. "Dear Judge, my name is Elizabeth, and I am the girl that Charles Adams tried to destroy. He locked me in the dark, but now I see the light. He told me I had no value, but today I know that's not true. I ask that you don't let him out of prison because he hasn't changed. He doesn't feel remorse. He only wants the control he lost. Please protect not only me, but other children who may be hurt by him in the future." When the lawyer read the letter aloud during the appeal hearing, even some people on the defense seemed uncomfortable. An act of courage. The hearing was the most tense moment since the original trial. Charles appeared in court, visibly downcast, but his posture still carried an arrogant air. He claimed to be remorseful and promised that he only wanted a chance to restart his life. When Elizabeth saw Charles in court, her hands trembled, but when she looked at Martha, who was holding her hand, she found the strength to face him. When the judge asked if anyone wanted to make a final statement, Elizabeth stood up. "I have something to say," she said with a firm voice. The judge allowed it, and Elizabeth, looking directly at Charles, spoke. "You don't control me anymore. You tried to break me, but I'm stronger than you." Her statement was brief but powerful. The courtroom went silent as her words echoed. The verdict. After hours of deliberation, the judge finally announced his decision. Charles' appeal was denied. He would have to serve his full sentence in prison with no possibility of reduction. When they heard the decision, Martha and Elizabeth embraced, emotional. "It's really over now," Elizabeth said, tears in her eyes. Martha smiled, wiping away the girl's tears. "Yes, it's over. One last victory." With Charles finally out of their lives, Elizabeth and Martha could move forward without the weight of fear. Elizabeth's courage during the process inspired even more people, and the story gained widespread attention, further boosting the impact of the Raíces de Esperanza Foundation. They both knew the road to healing would be ongoing, but now, without shadows on the horizon, they could finally walk toward the future with confidence and hope. The sun shone brightly in the sky on that special day, but the emotional weight of the journey Elizabeth and Martha had faced made everything feel even more intense. After the court decision denying Charles's release, the atmosphere was one of relief and renewal. However, the true confrontation was still ahead, and it wouldn't be fought in a courtroom, but in Elizabeth's heart and mind. Charles's last letter. A week after the appeal hearing, Martha received a letter sent from prison. It was from Charles. She hesitated before opening it, but she knew that to protect Elizabeth, she needed to understand what he was planning. The letter was short and disturbing. You may have won in court, but remember that shadows never disappear. Elizabeth will always remember me because I am part of her. You can try to protect her, but you'll never erase what happened. Sooner or later she will come back to me, even if it's just in thought. Martha burned the letter immediately, but the words stayed with her. She knew that Charles no longer had physical power over Elizabeth, but the true battle would be against the emotional scars he left behind. A new threat. While life seemed to be returning to normal, small incidents began to happen. A strange man was seen near Elizabeth's school, watching her from a distance. Certain items were moved in the garden, as though someone had been there. Martha didn't want to alarm Elizabeth, but she knew precautions were necessary. She installed security cameras and started driving Elizabeth to school personally every day. Grace also helped, involving the police to monitor any suspicious activity in the area. However, it was Elizabeth who took the initiative to face what seemed like another attempt by Charles to control her, even from afar. "He's not going to scare me, Martha," she said with an unexpected firmness. "I want to move on, and he's not going to stop me." Confronting the past one night, Elizabeth asked to go back to the old Adams house. It was something she had avoided since the trial, but now she felt the need to face that place one last time. "Are you sure about this?" Martha asked, concerned. Elizabeth nodded. "Yes, I want to close this chapter." They went to the mansion, which was empty and about to be put up for sale. With permission, they entered the house and began exploring the rooms. Elizabeth seemed calm, but when they reached the third floor, she hesitated. The small secret room was there, just as she remembered. "This is where he locked me," Elizabeth said, looking at the door. Martha held her hand. "You don't have to go in, dear." Elizabeth took a deep breath. "But I want to." When she opened the door, Elizabeth saw the empty, cold space that once represented all her fear. But this time, she didn't feel small or powerless. She picked up a piece of chalk that was still on the floor and wrote on the wall, "I am free." The words were simple, but to Elizabeth, they meant everything. The final transformation. After the visit to the house, Elizabeth seemed lighter, as if she had finally managed to bury the ghosts of the past. The next day, during a meeting of the Raíces de Esperanza Foundation, Elizabeth surprised everyone by announcing that she wanted to share her story in a national campaign to raise awareness about child abuse. "I want to help other children understand that they can overcome anything," she said. Martha felt an immense pride hearing this. Elizabeth was no longer the frightened girl she had found locked in the dark. She was now a determined young woman, ready to turn her pain into strength. The final blow to Charles. As part of the campaign, Elizabeth wrote an article for a major national newspaper, telling her story in touching detail. "My name is Elizabeth, and for a long time I thought my life would be defined by fear and pain. But I learned that love and courage can overcome even the darkest moments. If you're reading this and feel like you're stuck in a dark place, know that there are people who care. Don't give up." The article was widely shared, becoming a milestone in the fight against child abuse. It was read by thousands, including other survivors who sent messages of support to Elizabeth and Martha. Charles also read the article from his prison cell. For the first time, he realized that he had completely lost control. Elizabeth was no longer his victim. She was an inspiration. The climax of love and courage. The true climax of the story wasn't marked by a direct confrontation, but by Elizabeth's emotional and spiritual victory. She transformed the terror of her past into fuel to help others, showing that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and support. That night, after the campaign launch, Elizabeth and Martha sat together on the porch, watching the stars. "Do you think he still thinks about me?" Elizabeth asked. Martha answered softly, "Maybe, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're free." Elizabeth smiled. "Yeah, I'm free. and for the first time in a long time, she felt completely at peace. A new beginning. The months following the campaign launch marked the beginning of a new phase in Elizabeth and Martha's lives. Their home became a refuge, not just for them, but for other children and families who sought inspiration from their story. The Raíces de Esperanza Foundation grew exponentially, receiving donations and support from influential figures, which allowed them to create new projects in schools and vulnerable communities. Elizabeth found her place in the world. At 16, she officially became an ambassador for the foundation, traveling across the country to give talks at events and institutions. Although memories of the past still occasionally resurfaced, she had learned to handle them with the strength she had cultivated over the years. Martha, in turn, found purpose in her new mission as a mother and advocate. To her, Elizabeth was living proof that courage and compassion could change lives, starting with her own. A special meeting. One day, during an event organized by the foundation, a small girl approached Elizabeth. She was holding a drawing in her hand, a flower growing under a blue sky. "You're Elizabeth, right?" she asked, her voice shy. Elizabeth smiled and crouched down to meet the child's eyes. "Yes, I am. I read about you. My mum said I can be strong like you." Elizabeth felt her eyes fill with tears as she embraced the girl. "You already are strong. Never forget that." This moment marked a definitive change for Elizabeth. She realized that her story was more than a tale of survival. It was a beacon of hope for those still in the dark. Scars that don't define. As the years passed, Elizabeth continued to grow, both as an artist and as a person. Her paintings were sought after at exhibitions, but she always reserved a special space for pieces that depicted her emotional journey. Martha, now with grey hair, continued to stand by Elizabeth at all the important moments. For both of them, the bond they had built was unbreakable, something even the memories of Charles couldn't shake. One night, while they were reviewing materials for a new foundation project, Elizabeth looked at Martha and said, "Thank you for never giving up on me." Martha smiled, holding her hand. "You gave me reasons to keep going, sweetheart." A new tomorrow. Elizabeth and Martha's story wasn't just an example of overcoming adversity. It became a catalyst for social change. Reforms in the child protection system gained momentum after the exposure of their case, and other families found the courage to report abuse. Elizabeth's past could never be erased, but she chose not to let it define who she was. Instead, she built a bright future surrounded by love, hope, and purpose. On that same porch where so many deep conversations had occurred, Elizabeth, now a young woman, looked out at the horizon with Martha by her side and whispered, "I think I finally understand what it means to be free." And with that, they continued their journey, ready to face whatever the future had in store for them, together. 5 years later. 5 years had passed, and Elizabeth, now 21, inaugurated a major art exhibition titled Rising from the Shadows. The gallery walls were filled with her works, each one telling a part of her story, from fear and pain to hope and freedom. Martha stood beside her, proud, while guests were moved by the depth of the paintings. At the end of the night, Elizabeth took Martha's hand. "None of this would have been possible if you hadn't believed in me." Martha smiled. "No, you're proof that light always finds a way to shine, even in the darkness." Elizabeth and Martha's story is not just about survival, but about the transformative power of love, courage, and empathy. For those facing their own challenges, remember, even in the darkest moments, there is always a way out. Seek help. Trust those who believe in you, and above all, never lose hope. If you know someone in danger or suspect abuse, take action. Reporting can save lives. Together, we can create a world where no child has to face the darkness alone. Share this story to inspire more people to fight for justice and hope.